Hello, Shadowrek here, and today I have a video going over meta specializations in Mythic Plus, meta comps in general, and just kind of why or why not to bring meta specs to your group, and just kind of wanted to bring some mindfulness to the situation, as in recent years it has seemed that it's become more and more the case that groups in LFG will only want meta specializations, even if that choice doesn't make sense. So, what I want to look at is a few different things, and I'm going to go over talking about why it's not the case to just always bring what's meta, kind of different comps that exist and why they can be good, and some comparisons that I draw to bringing Phys specs from the meta comp, and kind of comparing that to gearing, and the same reason that like Abyss list isn't necessarily good. So, to get started, first things first, the meta specs right now are a single composition where it all kind of works together well. Now, specifically, outside of Yoda's group, which has Ellesmere, pretty much the best M+ Holy Paladin in the world, instead of a Disc Priest, if you look at the meta comp with Disc Priest, which is typically what's being run, VDH, Disc, Arcane, Unholy, and Balanced Druid, something that is lacking in this comp is regular interrupts. Disc Priest is the only healer that can't bring an interrupt. In fact, it's the only spec in the game that can't bring an interrupt. And Balanced Druid, instead of having a regular interrupt, has their 1 minute cooldown beam. But that is good synergy with VDH. VDH has Sigil of Chains and can group a pack right on each other, and then you can beam out of the chains, and that can be overlapped with AoE CCs from this group, getting a wave of kicks in, and then going back to AoE CCing, including Silent Sigil from VDH. So, if you look specifically at their comp, it works together because of how they interact with each other, but if you start taking any of them out on their own, it starts to fall apart. If you take a group that doesn't have a VDH, scrolling down and looking at one of the Phys Comps, let's say instead of a VDH, you have a Brewmaster. And in this comp, if you were to bring a Brewmaster instead of VDH, and have a Disc Priest, as well as having a Balanced Druid instead of a Feral, suddenly you're down to 3 interrupts, you don't have a way to stack groups, and you don't have the AoE CC that VDH brings. Now, this is only a problem when you look at it from a metacomp perspective, because the way that they deal with packs is simply different to fit their group. But that is a problem in a lot of pulls and a lot of dungeons this season. If you do drop 2 interrupts, you're not going to be able to interact with the key the same. Now, looking at Phys Comp though, there's other reasons why you wouldn't want to bring those. In the case of Poe's group here, where they have Brewmaster, Restoration Shaman, Feral Druid, Arms Warrior, Assassination Rogue, you end up with 4 group buffs that significantly buff every player in the party. So, first thing would be if you were to drop the Shaman and bring a Disc Priest, you don't have a great PI target in this group, and as well as that, you're losing your your Sky Fury buff on all of your melee. As well as the fact that it's just a strong mastery buff, it does do the main hand melee swing chance, which is a lot stronger on melee than it is on ranged players. It's also the Bloodlust in this group because you aren't playing with a mage, and if you're thinking about Feral Druid versus Boomkin, because of the synergistic buffs in this group, having both the Warrior and the Brewmaster, that's an additional 2 5% buffs going into the Feral Druid, and at that point, Feral's going to do better DPS than a Balanced Druid will. So, when you start looking at a different comp like this, where everything is synergistic to each other, you now have a group that has 5 interrupts across their group, as opposed to needing to worry about AoE silences to deal with all the interrupts that could be in a specific pull. They can set up and manage their pulls in a way where they just have enough interrupts for it. And because of their synergy and their group buffs, adding together the 5% from Brewmaster, from Battle Shout, 3% versatility, and the mastery buff, looking at that from the perspective of, say, the Assassination Rogue in this comp, the raid buffs going into them are going to be giving them about 15% DPS, which is a crazy number when considering most specs are probably tuned within 5 to 10% of each other, at least right now, as this is a fairly well-tuned season. So, if you're pugging and you're not one of the meta specs, let's say you're pugging as an assassination rogue, it makes a lot less sense for you to put together a group with a VDH, a Disc Priest, an Arcane Mage, and an Unholy Death Knight, because you're not going to have the beam to go with the VDH, you're going to be missing the interrupt on your healer, and you don't have all the synergistic buffs to buff your spec. And there's other groups that are like this. Scrolling down further, again, the healers are a bit more flexible this season. Disc has kind of fallen off a bit, and bringing other buffs or bringing Lust in your healer slot could be pretty good. But the Phys Comps are where this is always prevalent. You just don't have a Disc Priest in any of the Phys Comps. Mistweaver buff for all the melee specs or Marksman, basically 5% damage outright. And Restoration Shaman, if you don't have a Shaman in your group, Shaman buff is incredibly good. As well as that, in Phys Comps, you play a different tank. In Squish's group, they play Guardian Druid, you have Pika on Warrior, and you have groups with Brewmaster. Brewmaster, again, to any class that does pure physical damage, 5% damage. Guardian Druid's going to be about 3% across your group, and Prot Warrior in a melee group, including Hunters at least, that is a 5% damage buff. So, if you're to look at the group and just say, wow, this group has none of the meta specs, that's crazy. It's not really how it works. This group doesn't get better by swapping out one of their players for a meta spec, because in the context of the group, they're not better. On top of this, especially in the case of pugging and in keys that are not at the very high end, think about specializations and group comp kind of like a BIS list for gear. Now, while you can have a best in slot setup for your class, it's only best in slot if you have all of those pieces together. And the same thing could be said for meta comp, especially this season. Again, there's some outliers in other seasons, I'll go over that after, but unless you have all of those pieces together, they don't necessarily work the best together. And on top of that, just because something is BIS doesn't mean it is the best thing that you can use in your situation. So, much like it wouldn't be best to bring an Arcane Mage to any group where they don't have any synergy of buffs with your group, or you might not even need their priority damage, it's the same where with gearing, it's not necessarily the best to wear your BIS piece. Going, hey, my BIS piece is, I want to use a House of Cards, but you only have a heroic House of Cards while you have other mythic trinkets. Just because it's your best in slot, you don't want to drop item level for it. Yes, it's part of your best in slot, but if you're dropping item level, it's not going to perform better. And the same could be said about meta specs. If you're specifically trying to find an Unholy Death Knight and you're dropping, 100 to 200 IO to pick up the first Unholy that you can get your hands on because everyone's inviting them, not only is that someone that's already lower IO than people on worse specializations, that means, one, that because they're lower IO, they have less experience, and they're just much more likely to be worse. But two, because they're on a meta spec and getting invited more often, and still lower, that kind of indicates that there's going to be an even bigger skill gap, and at that point, it's almost never worth bringing someone in most key levels. Again, if you're trying to fit something specific into your comp, there could be exceptions to this, and there can be seasons where we have exceptions to this. Think like Season 3 and 4 of Shadowlands, where Destruction Warlock was simply so far ahead of the game that no matter what, you could just bring it. It just did like 30 to 40% more damage. Or, Shadow Priest near the end of Dragonflight, Enhanced Shaman early in Season 1 of The War Within, although by the end of that season it wasn't quite as broken. It still looked pretty broken because you ran Augmentation and it was getting PI, but it wasn't as far ahead. So think about it like that. Unless something is very OP, like that Destruction Warlock or Enhance last season, you're not going to use it. Just like you don't want to drop to a mythic, or from a mythic track piece to a heroic track piece, unless it's very OP. An example this season would be like Jaster's Diamonds is one of the cases where you would drop that item level for it, and it can be better, but other than those niche scenarios, typically you're not going to be better off that way. Especially if it doesn't fit with the rest of the gear, or in this case, your group comp. So just keep that in mind, that just because something is part of a meta comp or it's considered to be meta, that doesn't mean it's the best thing you can bring. And very often it won't be the best thing you can bring. The other thing I want to point out is just kind of synergies. I did talk about them, but especially pugging on Havoc for me is I do kind of think about group synergy a lot. Bringing a VDH playing as a Havoc Demon Hunter brings a second of the same raid buff and contributes nothing in that sense, as well as our utility is the same, so we have a lot of stuns. We end up stun DRing mobs really quickly, and it's not particularly good. Whereas if I can bring either a Guardian Druid or a Prot Warrior, that's going to be bringing me either 3% or 5% buff to my damage, and opens up one of those in other slots so that I could bring other buffs. And looking at the Phys Comps, that's exactly how these compositions work. As I mentioned before, in this group, having the 5% from Brew and Arms, and then 3% from Feral and the Mastery buff, as a rogue in this comp, you're looking at 15% plus more damage. This is the same if I go look at like an Outlaw group, where again, in this case, they have Warrior, Mistweaver, Guardian Druid. They don't have the Shaman buff, but the Outlaw Rogue in this case is doing about 13% more damage. Whereas if you were to just take this Outlaw Rogue and slam them in over the Balanced Druid in this comp down here, they're gaining no buffs at all, and they have no synergy with anything in this group. And they're just going to do 13% less damage. That is a crazy number. That is a lot bigger than the class balance differences between specs, and it's just something to always keep in mind, that synergies and having a comp that actually works together, both on the utility end as well as on the damage side, typically does make more sense. So there's other things to think about when it comes to comp, like you want to have battle reses, having bloodlust. Honestly, it isn't the biggest thing in the world, but it is nice. If I'm being honest, I think the difference between drums and bloodlust is smaller than most of the good raid buffs. Like, I think bringing a druid buff and losing bloodlust, if you're willing to use drums, is stronger than just bringing a lust class that brings no synergy. Especially if you're getting a better druid out of it, or again, something similar, like bringing a Havoc Demon Hunter for the 3% magic damage at a comp that's mostly magic. Bringing a warrior in a physical comp instead of bringing, a mage because it brings lust. You're going to be better served with that 5% damage across your group than you ever would be by the extra 15% haste for 40 seconds out of every 10 minutes, assuming it's being pressed on cooldown. For the most part, that's all I really did want to go over today, was just kind of looking at the compositions and why it's not simply always best to bring what is considered to be meta, especially in a season like this where, again, things are pretty close together. The main thing is just, it's been frustrating watching LFG, and regardless of any alt side play or just any group I'm in, most people seem to have this conception that you should only play with what's best. And they don't take into consideration skill level of players or other things like the fact that they're not playing a meta spec either, and they don't actually fit into that comp. So I think this is something that's really important to just bring up and talk about. I kind of wish more people would talk about it and mention it, because there's just so many cases where I feel like the wrong person is brought for the job just because they're on the right spec, and it forces people to want to reroll and just not even play the game. That's about everything I have for today. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy this kind of content, please leave a like and a follow for my channel, and I'll see you next time. Have a great night.